So we heard from Linwood about the complexities of our relationship with the sea. This panel, we will hear about the historic connections and how far back they go in our nation's history. And this cuts across maritime commerce, the need to protect our ocean interests, ocean energy sources, food from the sea, as well as coastal recreation, all related to how we conduct our daily lives, all going back over the history up to modern day. Here to guide our exploration of this journey is a curator of the maritime history at the Smithsonian Institution, Mr. Paul Johnston. He's curated over a dozen exhibitions, including On the Water, Stories from Maritime America, which everyone should go see, currently at the Museum of American History. Paul's worked on shipwrecks around the world, and is now working on a book entitled Shipwrecked in Paradise, Cleopatra's Barge in Hawaii, concerning a shipwreck of royal lineage. And I encourage you all to keep an eye out for it. With that, let me welcome Paul.
Thank you, Jason and Noah, for organizing this session and inviting me to serve as your moderator. As Jason mentioned, I'm curator of maritime history at the Smithsonian, the American History Museum in particular, and I want to reiterate his invitation for you all to come down and see our newest permanent exhibit, On the Water. It's air conditioned, so pop on down afterwards and come visit us. It's about 8,300 feet of America's relationship with the sea, and supported by Maersk Muller's Foundation. Maersk is the largest shipper in the world. So I just wanted to introduce my fellow speakers before I get too involved in myself. And our first speaker is going to be Mr. Paul Anderson, to my immediate right, who is Chief Executive Officer of the Port Authority of Jacksonville, Florida. And he's going to be talking about what goes on the Lower East Coast. He'll be followed by Dr. Michelle Kearns, who is an adjunct assistant professor at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis. And then Dr. Alan Thornhill, third in line there, who's the CEO, but he's the Chief Environmental Officer for the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management and Department of the Interior, used to be known as MMS, or Minerals and Mining Service. And he'll be talking to us about energy, offshore energy. And he'll be followed by Dr. Jeff Bolster, well-known author and historian from the History Department at the University of New Hampshire. And batting cleanup down at the end, far right, is Ted Balistreri, who is Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of the Cannery Row Company, which is a commercial development out in Monterey, California. And he's going to issue us all a personal invitation to go out there and visit him at the end. So, Paul, if you wouldn't mind, let me turn the podium over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Johnson. It's a privilege to be here, especially with this esteemed panel. I'm going to grab my stopwatch here. To be here and join the colleagues for, particularly for this conference. One of the things that may not appear in my bio or the introduction, particularly after the last speaker, I was born in Charleston, South Carolina, part of a very strong maritime heritage community. I was raised then in Southern California, where I was an avid surfer, waterman, fisherman, sailor, and a lot of those pictures were real close to home for me to see the changes that have happened in California in particular. At the waterfront. And I'm here today representing the American Association of Port Authorities, which is the trade association representing 360 port authorities in North America. And it truly is an honor to be representing my colleagues from around the country here at this conference today. And one of my messages, and I think this conference is so appropriate, to talk about our nation's maritime heritage. And I often speak to community groups and groups around the country about this forgotten industry, particularly with American consumers, when it plays such a huge role in today's society, in our nation's economy. And one of the things I'm often reminding people of is that our cities grew up around our nation's ports, not the other way around. If you think about going back to the earliest settlers in our country, Jacksonville had the French come 450 years ago. We just celebrated that last month, and the first actual commerce that took place on this continent. If you look at what happened with the Pilgrims, and it really was in Boston where they first sailed and settled, but it was critical to the growth of our country as not only an economic power, but as the way that we grew, not organically, but through immigration. We were founded as a seafaring nation, and we remain a seafaring nation today. Most Americans are not in touch with that. They don't look at our roots. The last speaker also touched on whaling, how important that was. You can read, I'm sure the Dr. Johnson can tell you about American seafarers showing up in waters off Antarctica and whaling, and the French and the Spanish and the English were just amazed. And after a very short period of time, we were there first. We did the first great expedition. I mean, the heritage of this country is built around our nation and its seaports. It is really important to mention how much of our commerce comes through our nation's gateway infrastructure, our ports. 99% of all cargo that's transported in and out of the United States is brought in on a ship. And most of those ships are coming from Europe, Asia, Latin America, from points all over the world, as today we're truly a global economy. What really has changed significantly is the age of containerization. What this has done, this was an invention of a gentleman by the name of Malcolm McLean-Cloud, who invented the container, which has grown in the 60s and is today the preeminent way that cargo is transported throughout the world. And it's revolutionized our global economy. You're seeing a picture here at our port today of two what's known as post-Panamax ships, post being they're too big to go through the current Panama Canal. And that's really changing. Another way that's changing the world and the impact of our ports is today ships, just like the age of aviation, when 50 years ago the largest airport in the United States was Cleveland Hopkins, because prop aircraft had to stop in Cleveland. Today ships are getting so big that they can no longer go through the Panama Canal. They had to expand the canal. These two ships that you see are actually through the Suez Canal, and they're coming from Asia with cargo destined for the southeastern United States. It's a major role that our port plays in our local, regional, and national economy. The economic impact of ports is significant. More than 13 million American jobs are directly, indirectly, and related to the activities of America's ports. And they contribute more than $3 trillion to the United States economy, and that is a trillion. So the economic impact of gateway infrastructure to our country and our rivers, our inland ports, are a critical part of the United States economy and the global economy. And they continues to be growing. The projections are that cargo coming into and out of the United States will double by 2020. I'm often also very fond of saying that our nation's ports and our maritime industry are an invisible industry to the American consumer that really drives our maritime commerce. As the largest consuming country in the world, even today, with 99% of the cargo that comes in and out of the United States to American consumers, I'd ask how many of you have walked into your local Walmart or Costco, this picture, as this picture depicts, looked up and said, wow, where does this cargo coming from? That's all come on a ship. And about 90%, 85% of the tens of thousands of products at a Walmart are coming from Asia. They're being manufactured. And what made that possible was containerization. It allowed factories to be a long ways away from where they're actually being shipped to. So there's been a real revolution in the world's method of transporting goods. The ports are playing a critical role, and the industry itself has many, many challenges, not to mention funding. All of the port projects, water projects, have to be authorized by the United States Congress in a Water Resource Development Act. There hasn't been one since 2007, and there may not be one because Water Resource Development Act is earmarks. And they're for projects and environmental restoration projects and for port channel deepening, navigation projects, locks, dams on our rivers, the Mississippi, the Ohio, and it's really impacting the way that we do business in our nation's commerce. Many of you might remember what happened to change this was in this invisible industry was about almost 10 years ago. We had a strike on the West Coast. At that time, about 70% of our nation's cargo came into LA Long Beach through that port mega complex. And we had a strike by the ILWA. Many of you will remember it because you couldn't get a Tickle Me Elmo to save your life for your children and your grandchildren. And it was really what prompted all of these large stores, Costco, Walmart, and Target, to change their distribution method. They said, wait, we have most of our cargo coming through one West Coast port complex. We have to change and diversify. So it prompted the all-water route, and cargo now is more 60-40 West Coast to East Coast today. And that continues to be a trend. There's been cargo divergence, so we can balance the entry point of where our cargo is coming from. It brings the Suez Canal into play. And today, if we ever had a slowdown of a workforce on either coast, we would be much better prepared than we were a decade today. That was in 2002. As you can see from this global map, the red are the old traditional routes that we've had, bringing Asian cargo where a good amount of our nation's cargo, our consumable goods are being manufactured. The blue is showing now as India, Pakistan, Southeast Asia, particularly Vietnam, India, are driving new manufacturing. The Suez Canal becomes a route to the east coast of the United States. There's this, with the shift in trade lanes, it plays more and more important role to the need to prepare our infrastructure for the inevitable change in the size of ships. If there's one message that I leave with you all today, and the impact of our nation's ports on jobs in our economy. Without our ports, we could not have the most advanced economic distribution retail system in the world. And it really is dependent on our ability to ensure, just like we do at our airports, that we can transport all of us to this conference in a timely basis, in a safe and efficient manner, and also with environmental sustainability. I mentioned that while ports equal jobs, we need to make sure that we manage the growth of this industry, and the industry has responded to that. In California, you have a clean trucking program. You have what's known as cold ironing. Ships now are plugging in when they're unloading their cargo rather than running their generators. And the amount of cargo tons shipped per mile on ships is the most efficient method of transportation, particularly on its carbon footprint of any mode of transportation in the world. So it continues to be a very cost-efficient, but also an environmental way to transport our nation and our world's cargo. So I hope that in leaving, as I conclude my remarks, that you come away with the critical role that ports have played in our nation's development, our nation's commerce, our nation being a superpower in the world, and it still is today, and that we will try and do so as operators of ports with environmental sustainability and stewardship as we grow these industries to meet our nation's needs. Thank you very much. I think I was asked to also share my connection to the industry, and I mentioned it earlier on, is as growing up in Southern California and how it's impacted me. From a young boy, I started surfing, surfed all over the world, and understand particularly, and as well as a person who has practiced catch and release fishing techniques for many years, and I want to applaud the efforts. I know we kick off this week catch and release tournaments around the country, and I want to know that there is a huge interest in the sport fishing industry to support catch and release in this country. It's very important. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker, Dr. Michelle Kearns from the U.S. Naval Academy.
Good afternoon. So today you're going to have a little history lesson. The way the United States, particularly the U.S. Navy, has related to the sea. During the 18th century, the British colonies in North America were, by every account, a complex maritime community dependent on ocean travel and protected by the most powerful navy of the era, the Royal Navy of Britain. As an island nation, Britain developed a formidable navy in the 16th century under Henry VIII to protect its shores and economic interests at sea. The mercantile system that developed throughout the colonies in America was completely dependent on the sea and the transfer of produce from the colonies to the British market. Goods such as tobacco from the Chesapeake, wood products from the Carolinas, and vessels and other ship-related items from New England were transported via ship to England to be sold in the markets across the world. When the American colonies became the United States of America, we inherited a maritime dependent economy, but we lost the Navy to protect it. Moreover, we lost our protection from piracy, both state-sanctioned and rogue. The formation of the United States Navy was to address national security issues of the day, the protection of our commerce and maritime interests around the world. One of the first issues faced by the nascent United States government was piracy. However, the Continental Navy and the small state navies cobbled together during the American Revolution were all disbanded by 1785. In the early days of the Republic, there were more pressing issues, and the world's most infamous pirates, those on the Barbary coast of North Africa, had thought to have been placated by a treaty between the United States and the Emperor of Morocco in 1786. Moreover, nearly all American nations had paid tribute in exchange for unmolested voyages via a number of Barbary treaties, starting with England in the 1640s. However, the largely independent city-states in North Africa, Tripoli, Algiers, Morocco, and Tunisia, did not all abide by the treaties and began capturing U.S. vessels and enslaving their crews shortly after the U.S. declared independence from Britain. One example of an American vessel was the Philadelphia-based Delphine, Richard O'Brien, master. He and his crew were seized near Lisbon by pirates from Algiers in 1785 and held for 10 years. A similar fate befell the ship and crew of the Maria from Boston that same year. The ship's captain and crew were held for ransom, and the crew made slaves by the local leader or Dey. In 1787, over 200 of these Christian slaves died of bubonic plague while held in captivity. Such actions against American citizens and vessels angered the founding fathers, such as Washington, Adams, and Jefferson, but little could be done about it, as we did not have the means to enforce treaties, as the United States did not have an official navy until 1794. The Naval Act, approved by President George Washington during his second term, remedied that. It was promulgated to address the depredations committed by the Algerian corsairs on the commerce of the United States and render it necessary that a naval force shall be provided for its protection. The United States Navy was established not to protect the physical United States, but its commerce and its maritime interests on the other side of the world. The United States Navy started with just 6 frigates: the Chesapeake, the Constitution, the President, the United States, the Congress, and the Constellation, and roughly 1,850 sailors and officers. Problems with the city-states of the Barbary Coast continued, and more treaties followed. In 1796, the United States and Algiers signed a treaty of peace and friendship. The same document was accepted by Tripoli in 1797. However, the peace only lasted as long as capricious rulers wished, and in 1800, Tripoli decided that the Americans were not paying enough tribute and declared war on the United States. This did not sit well with President Thomas Jefferson, who sent a naval squadron consisting of 4 ships to the Mediterranean. He felt it to be, quote, more easy to raise ships and men to fight these pirates into reason than money to bribe them. Thus, the United States entered the First Barbary War that lasted from July 1801 to July 1805. The U.S. naval force in the Mediterranean, headed by Preble and Decatur, was eventually able to force the Bashar of Algiers to release his American prisoners and agree to a new treaty, thus showing the world that the United States was an emerging world power able to secure its interest at sea. The problems with the pirates in the Mediterranean were at stasis until the outbreak of the War of 1812, when the leader of Algiers sided with Britain and again began attacking American vessels. Little could be done until the end of the war. However, in the spring of 1816, President James Madison sent the U.S. Navy back to the Barbary Coast, where Decatur and Bainbridge were able to defeat the Algerian Navy, negotiate indemnity from Tunis and Tripoli, and establish a protective squadron in the Mediterranean that would watch over American maritime interests for the next 45 years. During the era of good feelings and the presidency of James Monroe, the protective squadron model, used with great effect in the Mediterranean, was implemented by the U.S. Navy around the world. Squadrons were established in 1821 to protect American commercial interests in the Caribbean, to ward off piracy, in the Pacific to secure the whaling industry, and off the west coast of Africa to enforce the end of the international slave trade. An East India Squadron was also established in 1835 to watch over American shipping with Asian nations and European colonial interests. This period of naval buildup correlates with the growth of U.S. exports around the world. The more vessels flying American flag, carrying American goods, the larger the U.S. Navy became to secure our maritime interests around the world. The problem of weak states and extra-legal activity on the high seas has persisted since the days of the Barbary pirates. In the 21st century, piracy remains a national security issue, and it affects U.S. maritime commercial interests around the world. Moreover, it has emerged as a global security threat, most recently in the waters off the Horn of Africa, but also in West Africa, the waters off India, the South China Sea, and the Straits of Malacca, and the Caribbean. Political instability and the lack of a formal government in Somalia has and continues to affect relief shipments to East Africa and the Horn of Africa, both regions in the clutches of long-term humanitarian crises. The State Department has issued repeated warnings, that, quote, U.S. citizens are urged to avoid sailing closer than 300 miles to the coast of Somalia. Merchant vessels, fishing boats, and recreational craft all risk seizure by pirates and having their crews held for ransom in the waters off the Horn of Africa, especially in international waters near Somalia. This threat of capture proved true for the captain and crew of the American cargo ship Maersk, Alabama. In April 2009, 4 Somali pirates attacked and boarded the 17,000-ton vessel to take hostages for ransom. They came away with the captain, Richard Phillips, and a 5-day standoff with the U.S. Navy followed. With many U.S. and Allied coalition vessels in the region, the U.S. Navy began closing in on the pirates holed up in a lifeboat with their hostage, Captain Phillips, as they ran out of water and fuel. In the end, it was the U.S. Navy SEAL team on the USS Bainbridge and the call made by President Obama to act to save Captain Phillips' life if it appeared to be in danger. It was deemed such, and well-trained U.S. Navy snipers fired 3 shots, killing the 3 pirates holding Captain Phillips. This outcome is a direct result of the U.S. Navy's presence in the Indian Ocean and the implementation of the Combined Task Force 150 established in 2002. That, by 2006, involved the efforts of 13 European and Asian nations working together to, quote, deny the sea to terrorists by countering the illegal movement of weapons, people, and other materials. Combined Task Force is the modern version of the early Navy's protective squadrons deployed to safeguard our maritime commerce in the 19th century. In 2009, Combined Task Force 151 was established to deter, disrupt, and work to bring maritime criminals involved in piracy to justice. The U.S. Navy established Combined Task Force 151, quote, as a multinational task force that conducts counter-piracy operations in and around the Gulf of Aden, the Arabian Sea, Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, and was established to create a lawful maritime order and develop security in the maritime environment. The United States Navy continues to protect America's maritime interests on the oceans of the world as a global force for good, protecting the strength and resolve of the American people during this era of complex international relationships and political uncertainty for many foreign nations. Thank you. Our next speaker will be Dr. Alan Thornhill.
Good afternoon, everyone. I was asked to speak briefly about how the ocean has been and will continue to be a source of energy that powers our society. And I want to tell you a little bit about the agency that I work for and why I, as a conservation biologist for the last 20 years and avid surfer, like some other people on the panel, decided to go to work for the regulator that you all know as the regulator of oil and gas, but it turns out we regulate a lot more than that. So I'll tell you a little bit about that as well. As context for what I'm going to talk about, I want to briefly quote President Obama in his presidential proclamation creating National Oceans Month. He said, "Healthy oceans, coasts, and waterways are among our most valuable resources, driving growth, creating jobs, and supporting businesses from across America." If you go on to read it, he says, "and we want that forever." And really what that says is sustainability. That's really what the message is about. That's what the National Ocean Policy is about. And ultimately, that's what's going to be good for us now and for our grandkids in the future. So to me, this is all about sustainability, whether it's the regulator or the managers of the fisheries or the managers of the ports. That's what we're after. And that's really where I start. That's my bias. That's my default, coming from the background that I have. So my original ocean connection growing up in Southern California, well, high school and college in Southern California in any case, meant that I spent a lot of time in Malibu and Laguna, time that I probably should have been studying for the high school and college. But I ended up getting the degrees that I was after anyway, so I felt like the surfing time was well worth it. It tied me to the oceans forever, and now my entire career is there as well. So a lot of you probably know this already, but the oceans and the submerged lands of the United States as a result of the economic exclusive zone is actually a lot larger than the terrestrial parts of the United States combined. All that orange stuff. If we just look at this part of the U.S., which most of us are more familiar with, the 48 plus Alaska, that's about 2.3 billion acres, all the gray stuff. About 20% of that land mass is actually managed by the Department of Interior through the national parks and refuges and Bureau of Land Management and others. The blue stuff is the Outer Continental Shelf, and that's managed by one bureau of the Department of Interior, and that's the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. And we regulate and monitor everything on that 1.7 billion acres of submerged land. Our mission is to protect the environment while ensuring the safe development of the nation's offshore gas, oil, and renewable energy, and marine mineral resources. But I want to back up a little bit to a time well before BOEM or even DOI and talk a little bit about where energy came from in the distant past. It's always come from the oceans for a very, very long time in any case, and for a very long time people considered the oceans to be infinite, inexhaustible, and you could take from it as much as you wanted and it would always be there for you in the future. Well, there's no real good records about exactly how many whales were killed during the whaling centuries of the United States, but that number was actually not really tracked. It wasn't really important. What people really tracked was the total volume of whale oil produced, and more importantly, the tonnage of ships, because the more whales you could kill and render and store the oil on the ship, the more profit you could make. And so it was really the size of the ships that we tracked. But a rough estimate is that a large whale could produce about 200 barrels of oil. And the industry reached its maximum success in the 1830s and 1840s with probably around tens of millions of barrels of oil being produced from whales. Candles, soaps, paints, lubricants, varnishes, and fuel oil were the main uses of all of that. So if you do the math, we don't know exactly, but somewhere on the order of hundreds, if not, tens of hundreds, if not tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of whales were killed per year to supply the nation with that energy that they wanted. Something like 15,000 right whales were killed per year. That was the easy one to get. It was the right whale to kill, which is where it got its name apparently. It pushed the populations well below 50,000 globally, and it's only been recently that those populations have begun to recover a bit. Whales, or with the whaling industry, really declined because of a combination of a whole bunch of factors, including some of those wars that we heard about. But really, it was the discovery of petroleum products, specifically kerosene, that really meant that the fuel oil that we needed was cheaper in kerosene than it was in whales. So, offshore oil platforms have been around since the 1800s, but it wasn't until 1950s that the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act was passed by Congress, which introduced some regulation to this. But it took until the 70s, the 1970s and 1980s, when Congress passed a series of other laws that amended the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, including the Federal Oil and Gas Royalty Management Act, which mandated the protection of the environment while these resources were being extracted. And the Secretary of the Interior was designated as the one responsible, and he designated the predecessor to BOEM, which was the Minerals Management Service, to manage that resource. The submerged land is really what we were charged with regulating. One important amendment to the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act happened in 2005 in the Energy Policy Act, which gave BOEM authority over renewables. And that's an important part of the story that I'll come to in just a moment. So, as many of you know, BOEM was established in the wake of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill and is a part of the most aggressive and comprehensive reforms in offshore oil and gas regulation that has ever occurred in the United States. These reforms included significant structural changes and the creation of 3 new bureaus, which separated the mission that was in conflict with itself of the former Minerals Management Service into 3 different bureaus, each with a very specific charge. In the reorg, and this is what I really care about in terms of why I'm there, in the reorg, science was elevated in the Bureau to a prominent role. A focus during the reorg was to enhance the protection of oceans. One way we did that was to strengthen the role of environmental review and analysis, including the creation of the first ever Chief Environmental Officer, that would be me, and I report directly to the director. Science before that was housed underneath leasing. We now have an independent voice directly to the director. And we established an environmental compliance and enforcement group in our sister agency, the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement. I'm going to run through these slides very quickly because I don't have a lot of time today, but suffice it to say that part of the program that I run includes the Environmental Studies program, which is really science in service to sustainability of our oceans. And that's what my group is all about. And that's why I decided to join DOI and stay there despite the fact that after only 6 weeks at Department of Interior, the largest oil spill offshore ever happened, and my old job was still open. So I thought about it, and I decided, no, it's more important that I'm here to get us through this disaster and see what we can do about this situation going forward. So I stayed. I'll skip the program goals. Suffice it to say that we are really there for supporting the studies part of or supporting the science part of our agency. And over the last 30 years that the studies program has existed, something on the order of 3,300 scientific reports, hundreds of scientific articles in the peer-reviewed literature, and almost $1 billion in science research has been channeled through the studies program at what is now the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. We use these studies for a whole variety of things, including supporting the decisions that the policymakers are charged with making. But of course, we're not the only agency that works in the oceans. We have a whole bunch of colleagues that work across the federal government that we have to engage with on an ongoing basis. We support their research, they support ours. We support their NEPA documents, they support ours. And it's this environment that we have to work in on a daily basis. Now, there's also an incredibly complicated regulatory and legal landscape that we have to work in. This takes a while. This is usually where I go get water and come back and finish the talk. But since I don't have a lot of time today, I'll talk over this exciting slide, which dictates to us all the things that we have to consider when we do anything on the oceans. And it is the National Ocean Policy, by the way, that's helped us to make some sense of this complicated landscape. It gives us, for the first time ever, a common set of principles and goals and a vision for our oceans. If there's ever a conflict among these laws or among those agencies that I identified, we look to the policy and say, what should we do if we want the sustainability to be the number one option here? That's where we all go back to. That is now our common denominator, and that's what the policy has done for us. It gets us all talking about the same important end game. I'm going to have to skip a series of slides that I wanted to tell you about and quickly look towards the future. Strangely enough, the future is actually revisiting some old technologies. Linwood mentioned the fact that wind, current, and tides have been used for a very long time to power America, and in fact, we're looking to go back to those. So in a way, oil and gas is sort of a bridge energy back to the past, where we want to get our renewable energy spun up to a level that it is accommodating our energy needs. And a lot of that is going to come from the oceans. There's a huge potential here, but we've got to do it right. We've got to avoid the conflicting uses. We've got to avoid impacts. And where impacts are unavoidable, we've got to figure out ways to mitigate that and minimize that impact so that we don't, so that we're not sorry about decisions we're making today in 20 years. The National Renewable Energy Laboratory has suggested that there's over 4,000 gigawatts of potential turbine-driven electricity off America's coasts. Well, we'll never get all of that, but that and a combination of wave and tidal and current technologies, as well as others, or in President Obama's words, an all-of-the-above strategy is where our future is going to provide us our energy. So I'll stop there and leave some more time for questions. Thank you. Our next speaker is Jeffrey Bolster.
Thanks, Alan. Good afternoon, everyone. You know, this post-lunch time, we all know it's a tough one, so we'll try to keep it going here. It's an honor to be here talking about food from the sea, past, present, and maybe even future. Unlike most of the guys on the panel here, I'm not a surfer. I'm an East Coast boy, but I've spent thousands of days underway in the North Atlantic on commercial ships as a young man, on recreational boats my whole life. Next week I'm going to Florida to move a boat back to Maine with some guys. So I've always thought that the ocean was magical, something more than just a takeout service for sushi or fried fish, though food from the sea is important. So let's just go over a few other things. 71% of the globe is ocean. It's the great climate driver and stabilizer that makes this planet livable. It's the Earth's heart and lungs. As we heard earlier today, this most efficient highway in the world is the ocean. These gigantic ships have actually helped recently, in recent decades, to keep inflation down. The ocean, with its clean beaches, as Ted's going to talk about, is an extraordinary driver of tourism, recreational revenues. Ask any realtor what waterfront value will do. Waterfront is to help sell a house. Yet, despite this value added, and there's been a lot of value added through the centuries here, despite this value added, we have often just taken sort of for granted the goods and services that this ocean provides. 2003, following some disturbing articles in Science and Nature, Newsweek asked rhetorically, are the oceans dying? Now, I'm a historian, so I want to shed a little bit of light on this. So to help us understand what's been going on, I've actually just finished a new book. This is a crass commercial break right now. I want you all to write down the title, and on the eve of Christmas, the book will be out at the end of the summer, you go forth and buy it, okay? But there's actually a little story associated with the production of this book that is illuminating, and it goes like this. My editor is an old New York City book pro, really bright, been around the block for a long time, and when I first gave her the manuscript last summer, she said, Jeff, is there really a problem? I see fish in the market all the time. Yeah, makes sense. Common sense said to her there wasn't a problem. She's a very bright lady, but the ocean isn't her chief focus. If you'd been a consumer in Belgium in the 1640s, you might have thought that everything was fine too, right? Very cool picture here. Let's look at what we could eat. Down on the bottom, we have yummy seals and porpoises. We don't eat those much anymore. But we have salmon and crabs and cod and octopus. The only thing here that was not landed day by day in little sailboats and rowboats from the North Sea was that basket of dried cod in the back. Some of the salmon were taken up the rivers. Everything else, there's no refrigeration. There's no modern transportation. You can't get seafood the way my editor gets in New York from anywhere in the world in 24 hours, so she thinks everything is cool. These people were getting everything on their doorstep. What can we eat from the North Sea today? Not much, okay? Not much. Now, modern transportation, modern refrigeration is part of the problem. It has sent a message to many people that things are fine, but things really aren't fine. Now, we can eat certain things today with a clear conscience and looking forward. Eat all the farmed mussels and clams and oysters you want. The Pacific halibut is a pretty well-managed fishery. Maine lobster is on the rebound. Lobster's turned itself into lots of new pickup trucks on the piers in Maine, okay? So there are some things out there. Thanks to NOAA and National Marine Fisheries, the United States is far ahead of most countries in the world in terms of trying to turn its fisheries around, although it's a disaster still in much of Asia and Africa, and the Europeans hit their fisheries so hard that the thought of restoration there is harder to imagine. So unhealthy oceans are a fact of life these days, despite the fact that we can eat Pacific halibut or Gulf of Maine haddock. For the most part, the living ocean is in pretty tough shape. Going forward, if we want to really create sustainable fisheries for the future, there's a few things we want to consider. For each species, I put 4 questions on here. We can ask these questions about each species. Is it overfished? Is its population rebuilding? Does the gear being used harm the habitats? And how much bycatch is there? Some fisheries are notorious for really bad bycatch. Basically, what I want to say is that if we want to really have restored ecosystems and sustainable fisheries going forward, we need to think about the big picture, ecosystem-based management, but we also need to think historically. Historical perspectives on oceans add a lot of value. 1873, Spencer Baird ran the largest R&D budget in the United States. He was a master of getting what he wanted from Capitol Hill. And in 1873, as the director of the U.S. Fish Commission, he argued for the restoration of our exhausted cod fisheries. And the reason he argued that is because fishermen from Maine and Massachusetts, the Northeast, were complaining bitterly that the fishery was going to hell in a handbasket. Now, if you can see, can you see the years on the bottom of the graph there, the x-axis? So Baird is suggesting that the restoration of our exhausted cod fisheries has to come here. But I've just put cod landings from the Gulf of Maine through 1928. If we went down to today, it would be between the 2 bottom lines. If we went to 20 years ago, it would be right on the bottom line, okay? So we all know what happened. Spencer Baird says 140 years ago, restore our fisheries. In 1912, the Congress convened hearings, very important hearings. They went on for a very long time. Honey Fitz, the mayor of Boston, happened to be Jack Kennedy's grandfather, introduced himself to the Congress by saying he was the mayor of the most important fishing port in the hemisphere, and he was right. And what did he do? He came out in opposition to otter trolling. The hearings were about whether or not the United States was going to adopt a technology that had revolutionized the fisheries of Europe. And Honey Fitz and a whole bunch of other people said, this is a bad idea. Look what has happened to the North Sea already. 1914, this is just about a century ago, New York Times article, extermination threatens American sea fisheries. You're beginning to see here that we've seen some of these stories before. Subheader, drastic regulation of marine fisheries by national government is declared to be urgently needed. We could have seen that headline in the 1990s. We could have seen the headline in the 1970s, but this is 1914. Our nation's political assumptions and economic assumptions were created in an era of ecological abundance. And we now live in an era of ecological scarcity. And we haven't necessarily sort of wrenched some of our assumptions into line with that. So here's the challenge. Going forward, can we create sustainable marine fisheries? The United States is actually doing a better job right now than most nations, but it's a tough slog. Can we protect fish and fishermen? Can we promote restoration of depleted marine ecosystems? This is not a technological challenge. We have the technology. We don't always manage it well, but we have the technology. It's not an ecological challenge because humans have not yet demonstrated that they can master ecosystems. We can't really engineer ecosystem outcomes the way we want. We have a pretty good track record of making a hash of things. So what we can do is throttle back the pressure. But if we could talk about managing ecosystems to really get what we want, it would be talking about like managing the economy to get what we want. And if we could fix the economy, we'd be doing it. Yeah? So it's not an ecological problem. All right, it's a political issue. I'm going to suggest that going forward, we need to think more about precautionary approaches. You know, otter trawling is still very widely used. It's very destructive in many situations. There's certain ways it's fine, but there's a lot of problems with it, and it's still a very widely used technology. Now, despite the bad news, and I always like Mr. Downer for these things. I gave a similar talk on Saturday to a fundraising event. It's like, oh, get these people bummed out, huh? There have been some management successes, and despite the problems, we want to look to those successes. A century ago, there were about 4 pairs of breeding eider ducks in the Gulf of Maine. Today, there are tens of thousands. What happened? About a century ago, people in the United States, led by the Audubon and others, began to pass laws to protect birds. Lo and behold, the eider ducks came back. Striped bass, huge restoration success in the late 20th century. Marine Mammal Protection Act, 40 years old now. Lo and behold, if you don't shoot seals, they have more babies. Haddock, it turns out, is a success story in New England right now. Go home and eat all the haddock you want, okay? So we've had some management successes. Now, we've also had some qualified successes, and this is where I feel like I'm sort of insulting my guests. Here I am, a guest of NOAA. And right now, if you go to NOAA's Fish Watch page, you will learn that swordfish stocks are not being overfished, that swordfish stocks are abundant, these are 3 terms, and swordfish stocks are, quote, fully rebuilt. So, fully rebuilt? What criteria should be used? Legally, this is true. The swordfish stock has been rebuilt to the level mandated by the government 12 years ago. From a historical perspective, the swordfish stocks today are a fraction of what they once were. And I could talk more about that in Q&A. Okay, going forward, I think we should follow George W. Bush, President Bush, put more territory aside as marine protected areas. It's absolutely essential. Second to the last slide here, when confronted with a choice, which will happen, we got decision makers in the room, and when confronted by lack of conclusive evidence and research on the impact of fishing, which has been the case always, we never know as much about the ocean as we want, take a precautionary approach. Thank you.
Our next and last speaker is Ted Ballesteri, the Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Cannery Row Company in Monterey. Ted?
Thank you very much. Have a little light, just 1 second. I have to say, I'm going to show you a little slide. It's kind of a movie of Cannery Row before the turn of the century, early 20s, 30s, 40s. When we bought it, it was a deserted street on the wrong side of the tracks where nobody wanted to go. It was falling down. It was dilapidated. there wasn't anybody interested in it. There was a couple of busboys, myself and my partner, who saw an opportunity to get a building that nobody wanted for $200 a month. It had stairs, it was collapsing. We used coffee cans for these lights, which they're still there to remember our humble beginnings. We borrowed pipes from the junkyards and made rails, and our landscaping was borrowed ice plant from the highways. We will return it one of these days. It's been 40 years. But you know, when we were down in Cannery Road, two boys, I was 27, my partner was 28. We opened the sardine factory October 2nd, 1968. Nobody, and I mean nobody, wanted to go down there. Everybody thought we were nuts. We had a vision, we had a love. We loved that area. His father was a fisherman. My family was in the produce business. We had no money. When my dad died at 16, he gave me something. When he read the will, I was all excited. He left me the whole world to make a living in. But he left me in a great country with a lot of opportunity. And how lucky I was that he chose America. Because this is where it all started, on a shack on the hill for $200 a month. And my partner and myself, we never took a government student loan. We went to college, we never took an unemployment check. We loved what we did, and we had a vision. At that time, nobody wanted to go to Cannery Road. But there was other people today that monitor what we do, and you know, all of a sudden now everybody has a tremendous interest, which is wonderful. I want to thank some of the more important people here. Certainly Leon Panetta, who was a good friend. Dan Basta was a terrific leader. You're so lucky to have him. Certainly Bill Doris and Paul Michel. Working with these two people, they understand. They understand the ocean, they understand the needs, and they understand that the ocean belongs to over 300 million people in the United States, not special interest groups. 300 million plus people, all a part of that ocean. It's their ocean. It's their waterfront, California, New York, and our job is to keep it safe, sustainable, friendly, and accessible. So let me tell you how we can do it. There's other people here that I want to make sure. Linwood showed you Chinatown. One of the biggest Chinese communities used to be in Cannery Row. But he left out how they left. They didn't just leave to go to the gold country. They were torched. They were burnt out. But history sometimes leaves things out. Also, I like to, Fran, I did get to see your dance thing. And she's from Monterey in our area. And I hear she had a great show. I'm sorry I missed it. And Fred Keeley's here. And Mark DiOrio and certainly Jason Patlas. Those two guys are terrific. Mark, he's always trying his very best to make it a better place, to raise money for the foundation. With Jason, they work night and day, and they're just the best to work with. So now that I got that out of the way, I'm going to start to show this film. But by the way, Gaspar di Bartolo was the first, 1770, he discovered the Monterey Bay. He was called an explorer. The rest of us that came later are tourists. So now we classify everybody in the room. Now we'd like to start the film, if we may. This is, okay. Go ahead. Now you have to remember, when this happened, there was over 30 canneries, 16 of them. You couldn't even see the ocean. At one point in time, they fished over 250,000 tons in that 1 year. Now you hear a lot about sustainability, and I am 100% for that, being in the seafood restaurant. I think the ocean is our future. It's the #1 tourist attraction in the world. More than 80% of the people, since the beginning of time, live by the water. Things haven't changed much. 80% of the people in California live within 30 miles of the water. The water is the #1 tourist attraction. Look at, this is what Cannery Row looked like when a 27 and a 28-year-old boy had a dream. Nobody wanted that. It all started to collapse. started to fall in the ocean. It was a liability. This is what happens when you don't have a vision for the future. These are the canneries. The last cannery, by the way, closed around in '68. It was where the Hovden cannery was, where the Monterey Bay Aquarium's today. It was a fabulous time. It brought a wonderful culture of Italians. Hovden, a Norwegian, started the big cannery. And this was Monterey's #1 industry. They used to say Carmel by the sea, Pacific Grove by God, and Monterey by the smell. It's true, but we fooled them now. This is what the street looked like. Took 28 years to the appellate court a few times. Every environmental group in the world fought us, was with us, was against us. There's the Chinese portrait. And finally, they understood what we were trying to do, and it was unanimous. And the restoration of one of the most popular streets in the world started, building by building, permit by permit. I started at 165 pounds and I had dark hair. I gave you my waste and my youth. See this train? You'll see it's a beautiful recreation path now in Monterey. 2 people were hit by that train. One is all your heroes, Doc Ricketts. The second is standing in front of you. I lived, he didn't. He was a wonderful biologist. 20, 30 years later, I got hit, and I walked away. This is what the buildings look like. You think people thought we were nuts? They were right. We didn't know what we were getting into. But we loved the area. We absolutely loved it. We knew it had charm, it had character. Steinbeck immortalized the street. It used to be Ocean Avenue. They changed the name to Cannery Row, and he even said, let the architects, the young architects do their imagination, make it something enormously attractive. And that's what we tried to do. We tried to preserve some of the canneries. We tried to keep a lot of the history, and you'll see, here's the new Cannery Row. 4 million people a year come to Cannery Row now. It's the #1 destination in Central California. Every one of the commercial buildings, they have access to the ocean. Free public access. Every place you see there's view corridors. This is not done with 1 penny of government money or taxpayer money. Not 1 penny. Look it, they're having fun. How do you expect people to support ocean projects when they don't experience it? People who will support you have to love the ocean, have an experience with it. So our job is to have as many people enjoy the ocean, keep it safe and accessible, and then they will understand and respect it and love it and keep it safe and keep it clean and support all of the hard work of all those people in the room. But when you isolate them and half the people never have access to it, they're really not going to be that concerned about the well-being of the ocean. This Cannery Row has just blossomed. 55% of the TOT tax on the Monterey Peninsula comes out of Cannery Row for parks, for just everything, for community projects. This is what it looks like at night. That's the old cannery that you saw at the very beginning of the picture. Now you see these, you know why abalone costs you $100 a pound? They lay on their back and they suck right and they throw the meat away. They have the best of appetites. See how clean that beach is now? Kayaking. This is what you could do when government, the environment, and development all work together. You do something that's phenomenal for all the people of the United States to enjoy. And I want to tell you, as we conclude now, this is about another half a minute, all these are operations going on. That's a preserved cannery. That was one of the canneries right there. Our secretary said there's 65 million Chinese tourists. 70% want to come to the United States, and 70% of them want to come to California. And you know why? Because of the ocean. They spend $6,800 a trip. You want to turn this economy around in America, you listen to the secretary. They don't tax our schools, they don't tax our social systems. It's like confetti when they come over here. They stay in the hotels and eat. That'll turn the economy around. I just got another second or two on this film, and that's a little commercial for the Sardine Factory restaurant. This is the street. I think I timed this film to be 7 minutes, so I was hoping to stay within my time frame, and I apologize if I run a little over here. Okay, this is the part I like. This was all covered with canneries. See all those people in there, all those young kids? They're your future ambassadors. They're the ones that are going to say, well, I want that beach clean. I want my kids to go there too. We want it safe and we want it clean. You remember what that street looked like in the early pictures? This is the Cherry Jubilee. This is the car. That's an old cannery. That's how they used to put the canneries from one side to the other. I know my time's up, but I just got one more thing. We've got Santa Claus coming pretty soon here. And, there he is, Santa Claus. He even likes, Santa even loves, see the sea in the background? He even loves Cannery Road. Thank you very, very much.
And one of the questions that I wanted to ask Alan, and then Michelle too, is what is going to happen with energy extraction at the poles, and what is the American Navy going to do to protect American interests, if we even have any legal interests up there? I want to just get something going with Alan and Michelle here.
Well, there are a number of other countries that are Arctic countries besides the United States, and a number of them already have significant extraction and production programs well underway and have been for quite a long time. Where we go in the future is to be seen. There's a lot of interest by the industry. There's a lot of resistance by groups that would prefer not to ever see activity in the Arctic off the U.S. Where the compromise ends up is still to be determined, and that's really the focus of what our Bureau is up to right now in developing the next 5-year plan. The Secretary of the Interior will be announcing what our strategy is towards the end of this month, beginning of next month, and talking about how we want to proceed. Carefully is one of the words he's going to say, and cautiously and responsibly are other words you're very likely to hear. And the demand for oil that all of us create by driving and flying and flipping the light switch on is what drives a lot of these decisions, because oil from places that we don't control because they're not our territories puts us into a position of having to defend our interests and defend our American compatriots that have to put themselves in harm's way to deliver that energy that we need. So it's not an easy we should or we shouldn't because of one particular reason. Energy, like fisheries and everything else, is a complicated, nuanced problem that has to be worked through with all of the stakeholders at the table and done in a responsible and thoughtful way. Ideally, in such a way that in 20 years from now, or 50 years from now, depending on your age, your grandkids will be proud of the decisions that we make today. And that's really what we want to do, is make our grandkids proud. So that's what motivates me every day at the Bureau, is to try to put that information that's going to be required to make the best possible decisions in the hands of the people who have the power to make those choices.
And Michelle?
Well, as I'm not a representative of the United States Navy, I really can't speak to what they have planned for exploration in that part of the world. I would think from a historical standpoint, the Navy would definitely play a role in protecting our maritime interests, no matter where they are in the world. But I can't pretend to have much information on the Navy's plans for the Arctic.
So we're not going to initiate a program of more icebreakers and maybe fewer destroyers.
Being that I'm in the history department, they don't share that with me.
I will ask you in 50 years then.
Yes, then I can tell you for sure.
A question for Jeff. Some of the very biggest opponents of regulations for the fisheries are the fishermen themselves. And I wondered if you might have some insights on why that is and why they are against regulation and numerical quotas and things like that.
Yeah, this is a very interesting story. It goes back a long time. In the beginning of the creation of fish commissions, U.S. government agencies and state agencies to regulate fishery, it was all because the fishing interest insisted that the resource was being depleted, the resource on which they depended, and for about 70 years it was fishermen actively asking the government to save and manage the resource. After the introduction of otter trawling, which came in this country, the first one was 1905, 1906, but in 1915 the Congress decided that, yeah, we're going to let this happen. Within 10 years, the industry had changed profoundly and trawling had become the new norm. 95% of the industry opposed the introduction of otter trawling at those congressional hearings in 1912. They lined up man and boy against it. They got the mayors of Gloucester and the mayors of Boston. Everybody was against it because they said, this will pooch the resource. But once it became the new norm, it's now accepted. And once it's the new norm, you defend it. By the 1930s, we have the first split between government fishery scientists and fishermen. And what happened is the fishery scientists said, you're killing all the baby haddock by fishing with fine mesh nets on George's Bank. Maybe we should change something. We should have a regulation to increase mesh size. 1930s. The industry began to circle its wagon and say, oh, no, you can't do that to us because the Canadians aren't and all the rest, okay? By the 1970s, the industry, when I was first going to sea out of Woods Hole, the industry and the regulators were at extraordinary loggerheads, okay? So right now, what's happened is, in part, when I said our American political and economic culture was created in an era of economic abundance, and we still have some of these same assumptions. Let me give one probably politically incorrect little anecdote here to help you see what's going on here. The New England congressional delegation has consisted of some very liberal members like Barney Frank and some very conservative members like Bob Smith. It's had males and females. It's had old-timers, veteran congressmen and senators, and newbies. The only thing that the New England congressional delegation has really come together on, as far as I can see, or one of the few things, is increasing over the years now, rallying against the imposition of regulations on the fisheries. Every time since the 70s until well into the 90s until recently, the congressional delegation has come out for, quote, the beleaguered fishermen, or the industry. The assumptions behind that are not that we the people, the first three words of the Constitution, own all the resources, as Ted so eloquently explained. It's about the industry. So right now the industry is still in many ways opposed to regulation. We clearly have a lot of people in America right now who are politically, ideologically charged in opposition to regulation. All regulation they think is bad. Market solutions are great in lots and lots of ways. Market solutions are not always great in terms of management of natural resources, especially if you can capitalize an industry, which is very mobile, like fishing gear, and move into a place and take out short-term profits and then leave. So the industry is sometimes opposed to regulation, but I think going forward, if we want to have some resources, and the buzzwords are sustainability and restoration, very, very, very difficult to achieve. Okay, so this is right now, the good news I would say is that in the last 10 years, there has been more collaboration between commercial fishing interests and regulators and scientists than ever before. And so in some ways, we can see that we're moving towards a new horizon. But the assumptions are still deeply ingrained there, and it's tough.
So that would be sort of like meddling with Social Security or Medicare fisheries, the fishermen.
Yeah, well,
they're really that powerful a lobby. That's interesting to think, because I can't think of any other individual industries, even the car industry, that has that much power.
The fishing industry is not that powerful of a lobby. What the fishing industry is iconic, it's metaphoric, it's historical, it's visionary, and congressmen rally around the fishermen the way they do around the family farmer. Now, most of us know that most food in America today is not grown by family farmers. But if you want to get people in elected office talking about someone that's important, it's a family farmer or a fisherman, okay? So some of this sort of cultural assumptions and values has actually worked against managing the resource. It's not that the industry is that powerful, but they have powerful allies sometimes.
Like the Titanic, the whole subject has taken on an iconic role that transcends just the group themselves and has greater meaning. Well, Ted, let me ask you a question. You talked to us about the significance of coastal and maritime enterprise and tourism and all that. What do you think that a couple of extra feet of sea level might do, not only to Monterey, but to the coast of California? Again, I'm thinking here a little bit about the polar ice cap melting, and there's all kinds of threats about, the sea level's going to go up. I've even read up to several feet high. What do you think about all that, and what impact that'll have on our cities, on our tourism, on our culture in general?
Okay, let me start. I just came back. I'm on the World Travel and Tourist Council. I was in Japan, in Sendai, where they had it was devastating. It was 9 liters to 12 liters high. It wiped out the whole city of Monterey, like 28,000 people. There's nothing. And I mean, there's no way you can protect yourself against that. I mean, that's going to happen somewhere in the world. There's an earthquake in the middle of the ocean. That means it's 3, 4, 5 stories coming in above sea level. Wipes out everything. But we still go on, and life goes on. It's tragic, and but as I see it, there was a famous archaeologist at Harvard, Stephen Gould, and he mentioned, 20 million years ago, remember the Big Bang, the gas covered the whole planet, wiped out almost 80% of the species. But this planet is such elasticity and survival that it came back to what it is today. And man, in this room and all of us, think we can manage the ecosystem. We're lucky we're going to survive another million years as a species. I really believe we have to live in harmony with nature. We have to understand it, live in harmony, but try to manage what's supposed to be more than this and this species and that. Nature's pretty resilient on its own. We have to be a little bit more resilient and understanding how to survive and live in cooperation with that. I think if it goes up an inch a foot, we build all buildings 14 to 22 feet above high tide level, and that's normal for the last 100 years storm. But when something like that in Japan happens, there's no protection for it whatsoever. So I use the word win. What's important now? What happened years ago, we have some of the most brilliant minds here that will tell us about history. Tomorrow, I'm not sure what's going to happen. It's changing so quick. I can't tell you how to be a success, but I can tell you how to be a surefire, try to please everybody and do everything. So we use the word win. What's important now? Nobody coast uphill, just downhill. And so we try to do what's important today for those 300 million people in America to make it safe, accessible. If it goes an inch or two higher, the engineers and the scientists of the world will tell us how to build better and be more protective of the people on the coast. But to look that far ahead and to try to feel what we're going to do, I could never answer that.
Alan, did you
Yeah, I
want
wanted to follow up real quickly on your question about sea level rise and impacts to coastal communities and such. Just curious, show of hands, how many people in the room have ever walked barefoot on a beach in the United States, on the East Coast, or in the Gulf? That includes Florida. Okay. It is highly likely that each of you that raised your hands was walking on a beach that was renourished because the sand had been removed through wave action, through storm action, and through increase in sea level. As the increase in sea level and increased storm intensity has removed more and more sand from the beaches of the East Coast and the Gulf of Mexico, the demand for renourishing of those beaches has increased exponentially. And guess who regulates offshore sand? That would be us. And so 6 people and $2 million is what we have to make sure that more than, easily hundreds of billions of dollars worth of human-built infrastructure is protected from the next storm surge. And those 6 people and those $2 million are basically responsible for having moved, not necessarily the same 6 people over the last 20 years, but that team has moved something on the order of 58 million cubic yards of outer continental shelf sand from federal waters onto the beaches of the Atlantic and Gulf coasts, which is enough sand to fill 42 Empire State Buildings. And the demand is increasing. So if you need evidence of increased sea level and potentially a result of climate change, you merely need to look at the demand in permits and requests that we're getting for beach renourishment, because they're disappearing and they're threatening houses, infrastructure like roads and sewer systems, and all the other stuff that we've built up on our coasts for the past 100+ years. And it's only going to get worse.
So Ted, you're moving to New Orleans, do I hear? And what would you do in New Orleans?
Well, there is the Gulf Coast Restoration Task Force, Ecosystem Restoration Task Force, that is working on that problem, and they've got an action plan and a strategic plan to hopefully make some headway on that and related issues. The thing is with the Gulf, it doesn't just stop at the coastline. The Gulf and the Mississippi River drains something like 2/3 of the United States, and it all goes right there into the Gulf, creating the dead zone because of the runoff, and creating siltation problems, and not renourishing the delta because we've managed to channelize and fast track that water through, historically, which was a very slow-moving sediment depositing system, is now a thoroughfare for water and sediment, and it's all going straight to the Gulf. So there's a gigantic problem that is much larger than dealing with the coast and the oceans. It's dealing with how people operate in 2/3 of the United States that drains into the Gulf. So, when we talk about solving a problem, we really need to be taking that holistic, big picture look at it and thinking about how do we get everybody marching in the same direction, which I would argue is sustainability.
Yeah.
Jeff, did you want to say something?
Just a related piece, and it's I specialize in looking backwards. I don't have a crystal ball going forward, but we all know that since World War II, there have been some dramatic changes, and we all know that part of the dramatic change is the increase in the use of plastics in every day and in every way. And every one of us in this room, there's no one in this room right now who is plastic free. Your shoes, your phone, your clothes, whatever, your ballpoint pen. We also know that a lot of that plastic is ending up in the ocean. And if you do a plankton tow right now in parts of the Sargasso Sea, the North Pacific Gyre, the North Atlantic Gyre, you're going to find in some places as much mass in plastic bits as in biomass, okay? But this is really recent. We are talking about a phenom that is only decades old of dumping this plastic in the sea. Now, when Alan mentioned that the Mississippi River drains 2/3 of the country, every one of the people in that interior place goes to the supermarket and they come home with their groceries in plastic bags. They get water in plastic bottles. They get cups, they get plastic this and plastic that. For us to keep telling ourselves we're being restorative and we're being sustainable while we, and I'm guilty, I just drank this water, are using plastic in these sorts of ways, and it's ending up in the oceans. And it's only been ending up in the oceans for about 30 years. This is a really, really new phenom. But if you run the data out and you try to imagine what's going to happen if it's another 30 years or if it's 300 years, what are the implications? We actually don't know entirely what all the implications are because it's a new phenom. But these are the sorts of things in which I think trying to be proactive about is important, and yet try to go to the American Grocers Association or someone right now and say we should do away with plastic bags because some professors say that the Gulf of Mexico is threatened and the oceans are threatened by plastic pollution. You can see how intractable the problem is. So these are some of the issues just related to like sea level rise and some of these other things. But
Actually, they're already banned in Montgomery County. At least you have to pay a nickel extra for every plastic bag in your. So what we need to do is extract all the plastic from the oceans and build seawalls to prevent the ocean from coming up and
You know, I have to, if I could just, I was chairman of the National Restaurant Association. We represent about 14 million employees in the United States, and they're very receptive. Restaurants have been very receptive to change and customer demand, but it has to be based on scientific research, not emotion. You know, when those sardines left, you remember? You saw those pictures, how bad it was, all those sardines left? 250,000 tons a year. They said it was overfished. They said it was climate change. They said it was testing in the waters for Fort Ord. You know, I heard so many stories growing up why the sardines left. Then all of a sudden, one day, the undersecretary comes, I forget who spoke. Nature, if you never fished one, they would have left. They'd come back another 75 years on the planet. They move around. Now, I never knew that. And, you know, there was a lot of emotion and finger pointing. Don't get excessive fishing's no good. Excessive anything's no good. But everything has to be based on scientific fact, not emotional, not try to raise more money for a project so you have to find something wrong. Sometimes you got to find something right, and we all got to work together. We all love America. We all love the ocean. We all want to make it sustainable, safe, but we can't go, it's their fault, the fishermen. It's the environmental fault, it's the developer's fault. We all sit in the same room, we all have the same goals. And that's what I hope we achieve. That's why I come here, to try to convince everybody about those 300 million people, to make them love the ocean, love the waterways, and respect it. Until you get that, you'll always have finger pointing.
Was there, yes.
I have great talks, everyone. And I have a specific question for Paul. Great talk on the, great comments on the shipping industry and the moving of cargo and large trade. My name is Billy Causey. I'm with National Marine Sanctuary Program. I'm down in Key West. 18 years ago in Key West, we had 0 landings of cruise ships. In 2005, we had 526. It's been going up and down with the economy, but they're talking about going up again. With the introduction now of mega cruise ships, we're being faced with the challenges of perhaps more dredging. I know Miami is going through this right now. The point, where do you see cargo ships going, container ships, and do you see them going to much, to larger ships, as we will be seeing in the cruise liners? And where's the tipping point? At which point does it, do our ports become so congested that it doesn't work? In Key West, the cruise ships, gosh, half the community loves them and half the community hates them. And the bars and t-shirt shops love them. The guest houses and the hotels hate them. And so we're caught in the middle there, or we're not caught, but the society is. So what do you see? I know we need the transport, we need the trade, but where are we going from here, and what's your vision?
Yeah, very good question. First, I have a home in the Keys, so full disclosure, for the last 15 years, I've been going for 30 years to the Keys, and I know very well the impact that cruise passengers have had, not just on Key West, but if you go to any of the islands in the Caribbean, the impact that they play on economic tourism, but also on the environment. And I would say, sort of also with the historic of how maritime history interacts with our nation and our communities. At the turn of the century of 1900, Key West had the highest per capita income of any city in the country because of wreckers, so a totally different problem. They were causing ships to wreck for profit. So now it's cruise lines. So, but not speaking really for the cruise. First, the cruise industry does not need deep. The cruise ships are mostly don't need deep draft. They're built to go into small harbors in the Caribbean, where the primary and also in Europe. It's the cargo ships that have seen the significant growth. And the largest ships, there was a picture in my colleague's presentation of, I believe that was an Emma Maersk class from Maersk Lines. Today, I remember in 1997 in Port Everglades helping get a turning basin built for the latest state-of-the-art container ship, which was 2,500 containers. And today that ship was that ship there that the photo was of was 13,500 containers. So that's since 92 to 2012, 20 years. And there are ships that are currently being built that are 17,500 containers. None of those ships are intended for use in the United States because our ports are not deep enough or large enough, nor do we have the infrastructure. Those are typically for Asia to Europe, so Shanghai to Rotterdam through the Suez Canal. But the ships are definitely trending larger, and the simple reason is all of the reasons we've talked about is human population growth. We demand water, fish, sustainable, agriculture, all the products our world needs, and we know that our population will grow by another 50 million people in the next 25 years. So it continues to grow. We have to support those people. And the ships are getting bigger to find efficiencies and economy of scale. One of the key drivers of that is fuel cost. Fuel is typically measured by a ton. In the maritime nomenclature, it's called bunker fuel that ships use. I was operating ships 3 years ago, and we were in a panic because fuel was $450 per ton. Most recently, it approached $800 a ton in 4 years. So it's driving ship operators to build bigger ships to find you can operate the ship with the same amount of fuel almost. They're designing them so they can't go deeper because they're restricted to U.S. ports, in most cases to 40, 45 feet, where in Asia they're 50 feet and deeper. So they are building ships for the United States and building ships for the rest of the world. And today, if you look at all the shipyards in the world, 80% of the ships are too large to come into the current on the east coast of the United States. So that is the trend. I mean, if you just look at where it's going, and it's efficiency, the growth in cargo needs, and the cost of operating those ships. And I see that a continuing trend, and it's one of the reasons that it's a critical need that all of our ports on the East Coast are not necessarily big enough to handle the larger ships, and that's going to become an issue eventually for our country.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
There was a lady over here who had a comment earlier. I just wanted to check with her before I go to this gentleman with a raised hand. No? Yes.
I had just wanted to know about the vast sand moving issue of where did the sand come from to be moved?
Well, state waters extend to about 3 miles offshore. In some states it's more. Texas, I think it's 10 or something as a result of some history. Up until relatively recently, the states could go out into the ocean and find sandy shoals within the state waters and dredge that material and bring it to shore. But they've largely used those resources now, and they're looking to the federal waters, which is beyond the 3 miles out to 200 miles. And when you're out there, you're messing with the outer continental shelf, and that's when you have to come talk to us. So that's where the source material is coming from now, by and large, is the federal waters. And of course, sandy shoals are not just sources of good sand for barefoot walking on the beach. It has to be the right kind of sand for the beach, but that right kind of sand also turns out to be habitat, and critters like that kind of sand. And we've got to make sure that where we're sourcing that stuff from, we're doing it in a way that's not completely diminishing that habitat, that we're allowing enough time for recovery of those habitats. So it's not just an obvious go out there and scoop your sand and throw it up on the beach. It's a bit more of a complicated issue. And got a number of good studies that I could point you to if you're curious about all of that.
I want to ask
Check
you,
our website, and actually you'll find all of our studies up there. All 3,300 of them are on the web.
Can I ask you, some of the golf courses in Hawaii, they can't take the sand off the beaches for the bunkers. They bring it in from China.
Yeah, the
We bring the sand in from
shelf
China.
is very steep off of Hawaii. There's not a lot of sandy shoals that are shallow enough to actually dredge, so you'd have to bring it from a long ways away.
Sir, did you have an observation or question?
My name is Michael Jones. I'm with the Maritime Alliance San Diego. Follow on, Paul, to the question that you answered. It seems that large floating platforms, particularly harbors out in the ocean, is something that will be in our future. Lawrence Livermore National Labs has studied it. You point out that it's going to be very difficult, as so many people live near the ocean today, to find space to have another harbor. We've got to somehow accommodate the trade. So I'm really curious whether we're talking about the North Slope and we're going to put a harbor up there and the environmental impacts. Putting an offshore harbor is certainly doable. We did it in the Second World War. So I'm curious, as this is a panel about trends, talking about large floating harbors and large floating infrastructure in general.
There are concepts that have been certainly discussed. I think I've seen one in Popular Mechanics, those kind of ideas. I'm currently not aware of any plans to build offshore port facilities. There's been a number of efforts over the year to have power facilities offshore. Today we're seeing wind power is another example of that. But it's extremely expensive to build those kind of facilities. And then you also have sustainability of those facilities. You're in a marine environment, and you're in a very, as was mentioned, it's hard to control Mother Nature. And it's going to be very difficult, even as we see with large offshore drilling programs. There's platforms. They're susceptible to weather. And I think it would be much more efficient to invest in the current infrastructure, the land-based infrastructure, for port use today than it would be to try to build offshore facilities. And you mentioned World War II. We certainly did that. D-Day was a perfect example. But it was very temporary, and I think it would be just cost prohibitive to try and do that.
Yes, ma'am. No, it's coming. It's coming.
Hi, Meg Caldwell with the Center for Ocean Solutions at Stanford University. And I have a question for you again, Mr. Anderson, and that is, you mentioned the great efficiencies, energy efficiencies that have been achieved at the Port of Los Angeles and the air quality standards that have been achieved there. And I'm just wondering how quickly you expect the remaining ports in the United States to adopt similar standards.
Right. Yeah, I think that those of us, I grew up in Southern California, those of us in this industry, in our various professions here, pretty aware that a lot of environmental trends start in California. In many cases, they exceed federal standards, certainly because of the population there. The changes other speakers have talked about with the oceans and the impact of population growth. California is at the leading edge. I see many of the leading concepts and best practices for environmental sustainability being, particularly for ports, but other industries as well, automobiles, being starting in California. That's usually a lead time of 10 to 20 years before you see it working its way through other legislatures around the country. The federal government, though, has incentivized certain ports with grant programs to convert diesel cranes and diesel rail-mounted gantry cranes and operations with electric components. I clearly see that this is something that will probably be implemented, particularly to the East Coast, in the next decade.
Well, I think in some instances there is historical evidence that it's not always the ports that have to grow to dig deeper channels, but in at least one case, and that's in the case of oil transportation, the boats have gotten smaller. Back in the 70s, the world was building the ultra-large crude carriers for oil transportation, and now there's not a single one of those left, at least that's moving. And now we're going back to the VLCCs, or the very large crude carriers, which are much smaller, and these ships can get into American ports on the East Coast. So I don't know whether the ports are going to grow deeper or the boats will grow smaller. Ted, did you have something?
I got a question about desalinization. In Monterey, we're facing 2016, a real crisis. We're talking 3 people competing, Cal-Am. We have to cut back on the water.
Florida has problems.
Where do you see desalination? It don't ever seem to be able to get approved. And we're in a real dilemma right now in California. Water seems to be our biggest issue. Will the ocean be the answer, and how expedient will that cooperation be?
Well, they're building huge, absolutely gigantic desalination plants in the Middle East right now. So I think probably the state of the art is going to be over in that part of the world, and we'll be learning from them. And I don't know if any of those are really coming online. I know of 1 or 2 that I know people who are working on, but that's a good question.
We're running out of time.
Yeah, yeah. Does anyone have any observations here on that particular subject, or yes. Thank you.
Hi, I know that desalination is often really expensive, so a lot of times it doesn't get approved because the energy cost just doesn't warrant it. And then a lot of the energy production itself also needs to use water, so you're sort of in a loop. And so yeah, that's the main reason desal isn't as popular as it might be. It's not very cost effective.
Yet. Sir?
Gonna have to be.
Yeah.
The Maritime Alliance spent a lot of time with this. We've got 3,000 jobs in San Diego County. There's 50 companies. 2 of the top 3 reverse osmosis membrane manufacturers in the world are there. The technology is as inexpensive as water being brought down from Northern California today. It has been a political issue. There's 14,500 plants around the world. There's a lot of reason to believe that we should do desal. The city of San Diego just passed last October its first ever comprehensive water policy. San Diego's a desert city, but it's never had a comprehensive water policy. It calls for an enhanced use of desalination and clean water technology. So there are things being done. There's 10 plants lined up to be built in California. That represents 4.6% of the usage. So this country has been very reluctant to use desal, but it's used in Australia, around the world. So it's something we really need to get into, and it is essentially the same price as water from terrestrial purposes, and that water cost is going up.
He's right.
Yes, sir. Can you wait just 1 second? Thank you. Could you repeat that, please?
Several people have rightly observed it's hard to control nature. Well, the point that was made by Dr. Bolster about the precautionary approach comes in right there. But I really wanted to ask Mr. Anderson a question. There are 2 well-known problems with shipping, and one is ballast water, and the other is a lot of dirty ships out there. In fact, there was an article recently, I think it was in Science Magazine or something, about the total impact of shipping and carbon dioxide and pollutants from fuel use are pretty significant. Where do we stand on these 2 issues right now in terms of ballast water, invasive species, and the other one is shipping, cleaning up the more efficient engines, essentially, and shipping?
Good questions. The Coast Guard, I believe, has recently passed ballast water regulations that impose strict regulation of ballast water. For those who may not be aware, the ballast is the water that is brought in on a ship. They deballast to make it lighter when they come into our ports. And then invasive species that have come, the razor clams are a big problem. The Great Lakes, we've had also invasive species from coming up the Mississippi into the lakes. Which is not a shipping issue, but it just shows the migration of and the impact of invasive species. I'm sorry, the other one was of fuel emissions. And California, again, is at the leading edge of that. During their part of their Clean Air Act requirement was the imposition of ships converting, I believe it's 50 miles offshore the coast of California, that are calling on California ports, have to convert to a low diesel fuel that they would burn. And then also, if they're, while they're in port in that 50-mile zone or in port, they would convert to low diesel fuel on their generators. And then the other component of that is what they're calling cold ironing, which is just a word that they're forcing ships to convert to where they would actually plug into the local power grid and use electricity to run the ships while they're at port discharging. If you have a ship that's 12,000 containers with 4 or 6 cranes working, it sometimes could take a week to unload. So rather than having the generators running the entire time, they're plugging them in. So that's a shore power, but it's still using electrically or generated power from some form. But it is certainly more cleaner. So I see those, again, as trends that will migrate to the rest of the United States. There's certainly no regulatory regime or proposition at this point to regulate, make the federal regulations that I'm aware of. But I think you see the industry voluntarily going to many of these methods to save fuel, to burn cleaner fuel, to be greener, and have less impact on the environment.
What about the global problem, not just the United States?
Well, you know, again, we have the international IMO is the regulatory component of the international maritime community. You know, it's very similar to when you impose fishing regulations. The global community has to agree to these international agreements. Same thing, aviation. We just had a significant aircraft crash. They don't I forget the country where it was, but again, Russia, other countries that don't have FAA standards for their aircraft. So it's got to be international communities working together, international regulatory agencies coming together and having protocols that will regulate the global industry. And sometimes the United States is able to move those regulations, and other times, as we see, other countries like Japan and the fishing regulations block those on the international level. So it's a very, very difficult challenge.
Well, let's open this up. We have a few more minutes, and I thought maybe we could open it up for perhaps more direct questions from the audience to our panel of world-renowned experts. This is your chance, folks. Gentleman in the back.
World-renowned.
Hi, John Armour with NOAA. My question is for Ms. Galloway. I wonder if you could speak just generally about the role of the Navy and the Defense Department in implementing the National Ocean Policy.
Again, not something that is my area of expertise. I know that, especially in the parts of the world where there are issues with piracy, that the Navy is able to board vessels to check to see if different standards are being kept, but I'm actually not familiar and unable to address your question.
Yes, sir, you had one? Yep. Thank you, Valerie.
I'm Grant Gowan from Scripps Oceanography in San Diego, and I just have a question for you, Dr. Bolster. I really like your story about your editor saying, there's not a problem with fish, I can get them every day. But you didn't really tell us what you said back to her. And then you even showed us a 1914 headline that said, all American fisheries are going to collapse, but a lot of folks would say, well, we still fish today. It's 100 years later, so they didn't collapse. So, you know, as an educator, you're an academic, how do we educate the public and students about those kinds of issues to tell them the difference between fish in the fish market now and 100 years ago?
Buy my book.
I will.
There are still fish in the ocean, and there's in some ways there's actually quite a few fish in the ocean. And one of the, in terms of extinctions, there have been fewer extinctions in marine species than in terrestrial species. So the problem is that we can document 150 years of concern. And the initiative that sponsored, in effect, marine science was because fishing communities said, we're overtaxing the resource. That's what got governments to spend tax money to investigate fisheries. Otherwise, legislatures and parliaments don't pony up the money unless constituents are nagging them. So the history of marine science begins with fishing communities saying, we're running out of fish, okay? Now, I don't have the silver bullet in terms of how we educate the public, and it seems to me that despite LinkedIn and Facebook and Twitter and email and all the rest, all these things that have moved in the last 20 years, I'm not sure if the public is that much more clued in or not. I mean, I think programs like the National Sanctuary Program and its outreach initiatives are really important, but how you get that really into schools and affect the rising kids, Ted showed the picture of the kids on the beach, get those kids to understand what's going on. It's a double-edged sword. It is sort of nuanced. Number one, there are a lot fewer fish of many commercially valuable species in the seas than there once were. And that's, of course, geographically specific. We can talk about the Gulf of Maine or the North Sea or whatever. Number two, many of those species are not extinct. So what can we do to try to encourage them coming back? But the real story there is that it's been now 20 years since the Canadian Minister of Fisheries and Ocean, John Crosbie, closed the Grand Banks to the cod fishery. 500 years of fishing came to a close. The idea then was that the fishery would be closed for a couple of years and it would bounce back. And it hasn't. And actually now many fishermen in Newfoundland are happy to fish invertebrates, marine invertebrates, from which they can get a better price per pound. And maybe they're not entirely happy to have the codfish come back. But the codfish didn't come back. So, but we have some other success stories in management where it seems by throttling back pressure, you've really gotten very important restoration or bounce back of commercially fished species. So there's no one simple thing that I wish I could say a simple thing other than buy my book, but in terms of trying to send a message, I think we need to be optimistic, and language like sustainability and restoration is optimistic. If you go down in the lobby right now and you look at all the wonderful colored brochures and pamphlets and books, everything is for sale, that's infused with optimism. At the same time, we need to be realistic and recognize that we have about 140 years of history in this great republic and other places as well, where people spoke much of this same language. They talked about the fisheries problem, and yet they made a hash of it. So we can't ignore that, and that's a very sobering. That, for me, is the sobering side. So we have the optimistic side, the sobering side. They are a package deal.
Yeah. And then there's always the monkfish, too, which these are developing a market for trash fish that no one ever ate before. It's one of the ugliest fish you've ever seen in your whole life. It's nightmare stuff for small children, but it's now becoming very expensive and chic in fancy fish restaurants. So that, or we need to find a way to new recipes for the sea robin or something like that, which will.
Well, but again, there's a long history here of trying to develop markets for what was considered to be trash fish. I mean, halibut, which the Atlantic halibut is basically commercially extinct, and the Pacific halibut has been managed well, in part because of the disaster story in the Atlantic. The Atlantic halibut went commercially extinct in about 50 years. 50 years, 2 human generations. It was a trash fish for 200 years. From the 1630s to the 1830s, nobody wanted halibut. And then suddenly markets were developed, preservation methods were developed, recipes were developed, and the fish was hit very hard. They're huge fish. They take a long time to mature. And they were driven to commercial extinction in the North Atlantic by the 1880s. Men are sailing from Gloucester to Greenland and Iceland to make their halibut trips, whereas 50 years before, you could catch halibut in Portsmouth Harbor. You can catch halibut off Boston Harbor. Okay, so we hit that species hard. Now, monkfish, grenadiers, Patagonian toothfish, aka Chilean sea bass.
Scrod.
Oh, well, scrod. Scrod was not a word that any fisherman knew in the 19th century. Scrod is baby cod or haddock. It's like small enough to fit on your plate. Fishermen with a hook fishery never caught those for 2 reasons. One, they knew that's the future, and 2, tiny little fish don't bite bigger hooks. So if you fish with bigger hooks, you don't catch little tiny babies. When you go to nets, especially small mesh nets, and you catch all these juveniles, the fisherman said, well, we need to reinvent this. What is this? It's scrod. Put it on the dinner plate. That was not very wise in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, whacking the juvenile haddock and cod, 1.5 pounds, had never reached sexual maturity, had not reproduced. Sell those in the market. Bad idea. Yeah, so.
Well, fish go in and out of fashion, too. I had a very elderly trustee at a museum I worked on in Massachusetts who was a native of Marblehead, which is one of the earliest fishing ports in the United States. And he used to tell a story I went to his house for dinner maybe once a month, and he'd always serve me 2 lobsters, never 1, never 3, just 2. And I ate them, and I'd have these weird Technicolor dreams that night. But anyway, I said, why do you always serve 2 lobsters? And he said, when I was a kid here in Marblehead, my parents used to send me to school, and my lunch was 2 lobsters. It was really embarrassing. We were from the poor side of town, and I was ashamed to have to take 2 lobsters to school when everybody else was taking hard-boiled eggs or whatever the kids in that time ate. And now look at lobster. It's probably the most valuable fish you can, or shellfish you can buy. So things do come in and out of fashion as well.
One of the things on the fish, we have a seafood restaurant for 43 years, sand dabs. The names of the fish have to change for people to, but the fishermen fought it.
Yeah.
We try to call bottom fish blue tail, you know, people would buy a blue tail, bottom fish they're not going to buy.
No, that's gross.
So when we wanted to diversify and have more accessible fish, the fishermen fought it.
Pelagics.
So it's not always the cooperation even with the fishermen to sell more fish. They like their own little niche.
Yeah.
They don't want to spread it too thin.
Was there a question over here? Yes, sir.
Very interesting session and conversation. But I'm curious. No, not one of you has mentioned the term shifting baseline. You've talked around it, you've described it, but you haven't mentioned that term. I think it's relevant to every one of these discussions. Does anyone want to comment on that as a concept and a framework?
Yeah, I can do that. Shifting baseline is a term that was coined by a brilliant ecologist, Daniel Pauly. And what he pointed out is that science was often done with scientists, especially young PhD students, going out in the field and seeing what they saw at the time and assuming that that was normal. Or in a fishing community, going out and seeing that what they saw at the time, that was normal. So that's the baseline from which they would see change. And what we've seen recently, this book I've written, the chapters telescope intentionally. Each chapter covers a shorter and shorter period of time, and yet the rate of ecological and environmental change accelerates. So you get this inverse relationship there. The shifting baseline concept speaks to the fact that what we assume was normal was not normal. It's again the sort of quip I made about swordfish. Legally right now, swordfish are, quote, abundant, fully restored, and not overfished. My research group from the University of New Hampshire can show you very compelling data about the abundance, distribution, and average size of swordfish taken out of the North Atlantic from 1880 into the 1930s. The data on which the current standard was made is much, much more recent. The baseline had shifted. If the standard for NOAA's Fish Watch right now about swordfish was based on what we really know historically, this is the need for a historical perspective, the target for restoration might be more ambitious. And ultimately, if the target for restoration gets more ambitious, then, and so far we've actually had pretty good luck recently helping swordfish populations come back, the fishery would end up being much more lucrative. Swordfish is a very, very lucrative species. And one thing about swordfish, they're large animals. They actually grow pretty fast. And so swordfish is a good one in terms of you can get the population to be rebuilt. They come to marketable size. 5, 6, 7 years, you get a big fish. The shifting baseline concept is crucial because what it refers to is that we often, in these kind of environmental management issues, do not take into account genuinely historical perspectives, okay? And the system has changed a lot more than most people realize. And that's the, and I purposely put up the Flemish master painting from 1640 about what you could get out of the North Sea in a rowboat. It's really great because today you really can't get much out of the North Sea at all. And yet we sometimes think that there is this availability. So that's sort of an indication of shifting baseline as well. But yeah.
I think we have time for one or two before we have the 5-minute line of applause for this group. Is there any questions over on this side? That side. Yes, sir.
Dr. Bolster, what's been the challenge, the biggest challenge in getting, excuse me, John Jensen from the Sea Education Association, and then as one historian speaking to another, what has been the biggest challenge in getting this historical perspective integrated into management, from your experience anyway?
The academy is often built on disciplines. We get a PhD in ecology, or we get a PhD in history or something, and they're separate. For a long time, historians just assumed that the natural world was sort of the backdrop or just the setting for what was really important, which is what, generals and presidents did. And for a long time, ecologists assumed that what they saw when they first went out in the field was natural, as in not having been affected by humans because it's natural. Whether you're doing, boreal fish or reef fish in Puerto Rico or whatever. I think that the fusion of the disciplines is important, and I think that ultimately right now we do see that ecologists are thinking more and more in terms of both human impact, and historians are thinking more about ecology as not just that dressing. But part of this is the mindset, the cultural values that go with the disciplines, and we need to move beyond some of that, I think, trying to do some more interdisciplinary kind of work.
Thanks.
What about fish farming? Nobody mentioned like salmon farms because there's a lot of controversy. Now, if we're having a shortage and they have all these farms that nobody likes anymore, what is the balance there? Is it correct or not?
To create a pound of farmed salmon, you need many pounds of salmon pellets. It looks like cat chow or dog chow. And where do those come from? They come from other marine organisms, often forage fish that are harvested to be turned into feedlot salmon, if you will. 30 years ago, aquaculture was considered to be the future, but it turns out that aquaculture arrangements lead to lots of pollution in shallow waters and estuaries where the fish pens are set up. The fish are given antibiotics, they're fed, they defecate, this pollutes the water. It hasn't yet been worked out to be economically feasible. It's technologically feasible to do open ocean aquaculture, to have pens suspended in the deep sea, but they're much more expensive. That tends to distribute the pollution, but you can't yet bring those fish to market and make a buck at it. So I think right now the big issue in aquaculture going forward in the United States is the extent to which government regulators and the public will go or not go for GMOs, genetically modified organisms, because it turns out that you can tweak the genes of certain kinds of fish so that they will grow much more quickly. And this is what's currently being discussed, but it's a very hot button issue and I don't think it's been resolved. But I will say, in answer to Ted's question, that whereas in like the late 70s or early 80s, the idea was we're going to solve the problem with fish from the sea by farming fish, in some ways that's been pretty successful, and some species, again, the shellfish, mussels, and clams are great. But large-scale commercial penned fish farms have some of the same problems as like cattle lots in the Midwest. So
there's one
Just-
more question only, and that's the last one.
Thank you. Very quickly, Diane Davidson. I'm a consultant with the Ocean Foundation. There's also closed system aquaculture, which is being looked at. And with closed system, you don't have the same problems with pollution, and you can also try to do different things without using some of the chemicals and other things. And with closed system, if you do that in conjunction with growing vegetables and things like that, which they're doing some of that in Louisiana right now, and some of that is being done in Europe. And the Ocean Foundation is actually working with some groups trying to get that done in other parts of the U.S. So I just wanted to mention that.
And
Thank
with
you.
that, you got the last word. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our panel of experts: Paul Anderson, Dr. Michelle Kearns, Jeff Bolster, and Ted Balistreri. And don't forget to come down to the American History Museum and see our On the Water exhibit, which discusses and displays all of these things. Thank you very much.